I want to introduce three speakers that I consider some of the top-notch thinkers that we have in NARO in regards to equity, inclusion, diversity, people loving, people including. Like, without all those titles, these are people who see needs and they fill them. So first, before we start that, and you know, I did this at the very beginning, I want us to center ourselves. I'm not trying to be foo-foo, I'm not trying to be weird, but we know that in Alaska and Idaho, in Washington, and in Oregon, we sit on indigenous spaces, and we have a practice of recognizing those spaces. We're not placing blame, we are recognizing. Also, we want to be sure that you're centering yourself in your journey and everything that you've gone through and everything that's happening. So take about 5 seconds. I'm gonna just have it completely quiet, center yourself, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers. So just take 5 seconds with me. Isn't that so much better? So much better. All right, so I'm going to introduce each of these people one by one, but I'm not reading their bio because honestly, it's just too thick. They've done too much work. First, my older sister is back, Patricia Wells. You all got to hear her and I talk this morning, and we're going to get to hear her speak. This afternoon, she's the executive director at the Oakland Housing Authority. I could spend the next 15 minutes just talking about her history and background and previous work, but we don't have time like that today. She's our current national senior vice president. And if you want more info, look in the app, because I know you all downloaded the app. You can read more about her there, but I think you're going to want to hear her words. Next, I like to call George Guy my big brother. He calls me at least once or twice a week. This dude works literally as my big brother. He's the current CEO and executive director of the Fort Wayne Housing Authority over in Indiana. Now, this man, I don't know when he sleeps. He's on 17 boards. He runs a housing authority. They're doing great stuff in their community. They're housing people. He has a job, and yet he still finds time both locally and nationally to be a part of these conversations. And I like to consider him a real thought leader. And last but not least, I call Elizabeth Glenn the Oracle. I saw her several years ago at a national conference, and I gave her a hug and I said, "You're special." And she pointed at me and said I was special. And then we looked like that Spider-Man meme where they're pointing at each other. Some of y'all know what I'm talking about. It's like, you're special, I'm special, you're special, I'm special. She's everything to NARO. She's the chairperson of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Committee. She's well-versed in planning and housing. She hails from Essex, Maryland. And like I said, I like to call her the Oracle. So if you have questions, do not wait. Put them in the chat. We will be allowing you to unmute at the very end to ask your questions, but we're gonna just dive in. So first couple questions I have, and I'm going to start with Patricia, then I'm going to go to Liz, then I'm going to go to George. The first question is, what are your thoughts about where we are at in America? Specifically, there have been high profile deaths, there's been economic downturn, there has been a social action in some of our cities, both large and small. How are you handling it? What are your thoughts about that? How is it affecting your community? Give us some light, and I'm gonna start with Ms. Patricia.
Hey there, good afternoon again to my friends. This is probably going to be one of the more important conversations I've had the privilege to be a part of today. And I want to humbly say that I come very emotional. And so forgive me when I stumble, because as I looked at the questions and what we're going to talk about today, it resonated a lot within me. Liz would say that I might be handling some of the trauma that I've experienced in my path, and that's okay. And you ask, where do I think we are in America? We're in the place we need to be, quite frankly. And it's a place that we should have been a long time ago, because we've been here before. We had moments of conversation and moments of reflection, but we've not made it a process of change consistently. We've done amazing things, but we've not held to it. So right now I see us in a space where we have a choice to make, a choice of taking on our convictions and actually doing the hard work, the courageous work of making change, quite frankly. How have I handled it? You know, I'm big sister to Cupid. I'm twin to George, just so we're clear, George. I'm not big sister, we twins now. I've done quite a bit of share protesting back in the day. Not been arrested, came close. I've been assaulted by members of the Klan. I have marched along folks who are no longer with us, partly because of the work that they did in advocacy. So to me, this is natural. Yet the anger is different. And here in Oakland, I bring a very East Coast flavor because I was raised in Philly. And I have to tell you, it's a different kind of anger because our paths were different. You know, on the East Coast, you kind of know where folks are coming from. And it's easy to say, you know what you know, what you know. And it's somewhat easier to deal with. Whereas perhaps on the West Coast, we hug you and love you, but it may not all be authentic. And so what we've chosen to do here in Oakland is to embrace the need to express how we feel. I mean, that's what inclusion is all about, is looking at one another's differences, right? And embracing those and then learning how to communicate with one another. As a housing authority that has its own police department, sworn, fully sworn, 37 sworn officers, total department complement of 50, we've been at the forefront of these conversations. We have a dynamic police chief who is chosen through his cadet program and his Explorer program. Those are young high school and college students, to hold community dialogues. You know, we have the food, we do all the social distancing, but we had tears, we had anger, we had folks use and call us out of our name to talk about how it feels when their communities are policed and they just happen to be mostly Black folk and people of color, Latina, and immigrant populations. What's really interesting is that anger also included affirmation and appreciation that our police department is all about community policing and engagement. We've had tough conversations after the murder of Mr. Floyd. I had a young lady of 21 years old who I was mentoring say, you invite me to meetings, but you don't let me use my real voice. You want me to talk polite. Humbled me, right? And so now we're thinking of different ways to have conversations where they can be real. And yet when the senator comes in, you know, perhaps not using the bomb word or cussing the senator out, but still expressing themselves. But I needed to hear that I was arguably trying to wash over who this young lady was, and she felt it. We've also done the same thing with our resident advisory board and at two of our communities where we have had a rash of violence, most recently at a party. A young man of 19, recent graduate on his way to college, just happened to be at the wrong party, and we lost him 2 weeks ago. And trying to deal with not just communicating with his family, but with our officers who were first to arrive and see that, to the neighbors who saw it, and to just all of us in general pain. So we're about conversation, we're about engagement, we're about giving folks the gift and the right to talk who they are. At the same time, trying to keep us forward focused. How do we make the change? Here at the Housing Authority, one of the first things I did was changed our procurement marketing activities and making sure that we go beyond just those entities that we know can do the right deal or do a development project expertly, but inviting everyone to the table and everyone having an opportunity to compete. And those are changes that I made new in the game, roughly within the first week, realizing that I was now Charlie Wells' little girl in a space where I can make some decisions to start real change. And it felt good. And I think Daddy's smiling down upon me. So that's hopefully kind of just an idea of what I see today. I see America as the place to lead opportunity and to actually be the nation that shows what true equity, inclusion, neighborliness, community really means.
Thank you, Patricia, for that. Liz, give us some wisdom.
Well, boy, have we arrived at a fracture in the consciousness of America. We have long been a nation preoccupied with race and violence. It's part of our founding. It's part of the way we have interacted with each other over centuries. And it is part of the pain and the anger and the divisiveness that have become almost a hallmark of our society right now. Many of you who know me know that I am fascinated by international and global practices in housing and community development, and my colleagues around the world are just terrified for what they see, that finally there's been this eruption that just keeps boiling over with rage and anger and frustration and pain. We've all been harmed and pained through what has been the preoccupation with race and class in our country. But in the midst of all of this, I am heartwarmed by the voices that are crying out and that are seeking forgiveness and that are seeking healing and that are looking for a way forward. While we may be the inheritors of our past, we are not defined by that in our future. And we are at a point in our history as a society where we really have to make some serious choices about how we relate to each other and how we value each other. And quite frankly, how we love each other. Because the more I think about the voices of the past 50 years and the urgent necessity of love and replacing hate with love, I am mindful that we're never going to get to a place of reconciliation if we're not motivated by love. And I'm not talking about the huggy type, I see you and I send you love notes every day. I'm making nice with you and you're okay, I'm okay. No, I'm talking about that tough love, where we can have those honest conversations and that we can talk from the framework of past pain and past anger. Because until we do that, we really can't heal. I can't heal from being afraid whenever a cop pulls me over because I have a really heavy foot on the gas pedal. I still shake, even though I know I am a law-abiding grandma. I can't help but feel fear when I think about my grandsons and knowing that they are beautiful and wonderful and strong. But they also have to be told how to behave when in the presence of police, or how to behave when in the presence of figures of authority. And while we should all teach our children respect and proper acknowledgement of the places that our elders hold in our society, we should not, as Black mothers and brown mothers and yellow mothers, have to teach our children to basically subvert their voices, subvert their anger, and not question. That is a sad commentary. So how has this impacted me? How do I feel? Honestly, I vacillate between being angry, and this really has been a part of my life for the past 50 years. That anger has led to internalization of anger and frustration. It affects my health. And so when I listen to current discussion about racism being a public health issue, we can point to that in very obvious ways by looking at COVID and who's most affected by COVID. And the comorbidities that have been discussed are often the comorbidities of people who have lived under the oppressive foot or knee of somebody on their throat or somebody on their back. And so how do we turn this around? How do we take that rage and that frustration and that pain and make it positive? How do we come from that space of compassion, of really caring? And how do we change the heart and hearts and minds of those who have gone to their quarters and hunkered down and say, no, I do not believe that we are all created equal. So how do we do that? I look at my own jurisdiction. I come from Baltimore County. I grew up in Baltimore City. We were a leader in the country in establishing land restricted areas. so that Black folks and Jews especially would be contained and confined to their area. When you combine that with the perspective of HUD that we should not disturb neighborhood composition and that we should keep that intact, basically what that was just a reinforcement of the restrictions that had been placed on people of color and where they could live and where we could cite housing for them. So how do you respond to that? I worked in the planning department for a number of years. And my biggest frustration was trying to educate our elected officials and our appointed officials that, for example, maybe downzoning every available parcel in an already overbuilt section of the county is not a good idea. That maybe in a county that has the first planned urban-rural demarcation line, where growth is restricted to only 1/3 of the county's landmass, so that the balance of the county is really restricted to low-density uses, estates, golf courses, agricultural, conservation areas, parkland, conservancy land, so that the pressure is on where 90% of the people live in 30% of the land, and where transportation routes are inadequate, and where schools in certain established communities are resource less, and where we constantly talk about issues like crime and those people from the city and the you know who, those people and they, as if we are constantly at war with our human capital, with the most precious resource we possess. So my response to all of this is, as an old organizer, is to let's organize, folks. And that means reaching out. We used to call them one-on-ones. And if that means, as George does, goes out and have conversations every week with the same people, but a growing audience of who do we bring in this fight? How do we strategize and educate and inspire and enlighten those of us who are committed to the struggle? But also, how do we begin to frame the arguments so that we can convince our allies to work with us and not be afraid and be willing to be bold and to speak out about the things that matter? Because truly, silence is violence, and we begin to lose our souls when we stop speaking out. So for all the people around the country right now that are angry, that are giving voice to their frustration, I urge us all to think cohesively, strategically, and yes, peacefully, because we still have to operate from the perspective of love. And
Yeah.
love does not have any room in our hearts for anger and hate. So this is where we begin.
Thank you for that. George, it's always tough following those two.
Man, it's always tough following. I mean, these amazing, I mean, you know, we got Liz, you got our senior vice president, and so it's tough to do. So I'll do the best I can. First, I want to acknowledge PNRC for having me. I'm humbled by this and to be joined by Liz and Patricia to have this conversation. And I want to send something special to the city of Portland. I know you all have been put in an unfortunate circumstance right now. And actually, it's an unusual place too. It's not somewhere where you think it'd be one of the epicenters of this struggle that we're in, this conversation we're having right now. So, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. I'm humbled to be here today. So as an optimistic so-called leader, I'm looking at this as an opportunity for reconciliation and reconstruction and then reimagining what it should be. That's kind of personally where I'm at right now. I think some of the things that we're doing, Cupid, is we're strengthening our partnerships and collaborations. I think that's what's necessary. We've always looked at ourselves as essential in the city of Fort Wayne. I come before you, I got to be honest with you. I mean, I am part of that, one of those people that Liz talked about. I come from those neighborhoods. I am the great grandson of a Civil War veteran. I am a grandson of a postal worker, retired postal worker. And like Liz, my mother was a counselor and a community organizer. So I was one of those people. Um, so my job has always been to try to make sure that we take care of these inequities that exist in these systems that we have in terms of shore them up. So that's when I talk about always looking for an opportunity to be optimistic and try to shore up the system to make sure it's fair for everybody. So housing has always expanded to us. So we try to look at that way for our residents. And we try to make sure that we're partnering and make sure we're shoring up our partnerships right now, because now more than ever, we recognize what the inequities are. So we're constantly continue to talk about access to education. So 2 years ago, we had already made it a resolution to make sure that every child is at grade level reading. So what we're doing is we're making sure that that continues to happen during this time. We're making sure that everybody has access to Wi-Fi, so parents don't have to worry about those decisions. We're making sure folks have transportation. We're making sure that tutoring is available. And we do that by continuing to partner. We're making sure people have transportation. We're making sure people have access to testing. We were a testing site. So we're also making sure that our partnerships in terms of that go outside of public housing are still there. So we're continuing to administer ESG funds. We're continuing to administer all of the CDBG dollars that we get in terms of investing in our communities. We're partnering with the state as it pertains to tenant-based rental assistance, as it pertains to residents who can't afford rent. And we're making sure that we're available to our stakeholders, the people that we work with every day. Internally as a team, Cupid, I think you asked the question of what we're doing with our people. Again, the things that are important are people, the people that do the job, and recognizing the work that they do. So we want to make sure that we allow them the flexibilities, because many of these people are part of that community as well. So we want to make sure that they're ready to do the work. They're on the front lines every day. They're essential. And so we want to make sure that we continue to recognize them and allow them the flexibilities to do their job, but also take care of their families at the same time. So it's just been a reminder how important these things are. And I think that's what COVID-19 had represented. And also, like I said, when we talk about the death of George Floyd, I think we were front and center with the injustices that have existed since I've been alive. But it's been tough for me personally, because I think you also asked, as a family, how are we dealing with it and what kind of conversations? As a father of 5, and I have 3 boys, and I have a 14-year-old right now who has sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a condition that is often, more than often, it's African Americans that carry, because it's a disease that, or ailment, I should say, that was contracted as a way of defense mechanism for malaria, and just so happened that that defense mechanism led to this blood deficiency. It's one of those ailments that they talk about, that's conditions that they talk about that the virus doesn't cooperate with, or the virus doesn't go well. So we're hunkered in. But imagine having that conversation and trying to protect yourself, and then you're hearing folks talk about death in such a cavalier way. And then there's those that are faced with the decision, because if it's life or death for them. So to hear that talked about, and at the same time, having to have a conversation with your children about life is not fair for you because of the color of your skin. I can tell you that when I moved to Fort Wayne, I always knew, again, I lived in that neighborhood and those people. I didn't know until I moved to Indiana what segregation was. My kids attend a school where it's 95% white. I never had that before happen. The city itself is 15% African American, but the side of town that I moved in when I got here wasn't very diverse. So my children's friends were looked like everybody. They had a birthday party at the end of January prior to all this madness, and it was folks represented. They have friends from Jewish descent. I believe they have African, white, and just looks everywhere. So it was tough to have those conversations with your Black children when they're going to be faced with these people every day, because you don't want them to look at and have a disadvantage. That's part of the system. When we talk about the inequities that exist and systemic racism, is that's part of the challenge that we have, because even as a Black leader, we have to position ourselves in such a way to get to where we're at, to deal with some of the inequities just to make it to where we're at. And so you want to challenge it. You don't want your children to have to go through the same thing. So you try not to have that conversation. But then when this situation happened, you know, you pick and choose the times when you're going to have the conversation. But when this situation happened, you're sitting at home, you got to have the conversation. And so that's what we're doing personally and professionally. We're continuing to focus on resolving these inequities and making sure that our children are best prepared for it. But we still want them to maintain this ideal of optimism and fairness in this world as well.
Thank you, George, for that. We have a bunch more questions, so we're going to ask each of the speakers to tighten it up because we want to hear so much more from you. And now it's time to get extremely real, because in the Pacific Northwest, we believe in radical honesty, right? So I'm going to combine these next two questions. I'm going to start with Liz, then it's going to go to you, George, and then it's going to go to you, Ms. Patricia. And the questions that I'm going to combine is this. The first part is, much of this is hard to handle. Much of this is hard to handle. Across the Pacific Northwest, we have individuals who might not happen to be Black, but they care just as much. And they work in communities where they're the representative of everything that is bad, that is a part of this nation. They're the system, they're the man, whether they're a woman, whether they're, you know, whatever they are, as long as they have that government entity behind their name, they are the ones who are answering the questions. They're the ones who are applying the discrimination, whether they're Black, white, indigenous, other. What I want to know is, how are you suggesting that people take care of themselves, and how can they support this work from where they're at, knowing everything that they're going through? So it was those two questions I had combined for our NARO family in the Pacific Northwest, many of which are not people of color, but they're working in those communities. They're as dedicated, and for the communities of color, how do they deal with all this? Like, how do they deal with all this and continue to do their work? And I'm gonna start with you, Liz.
Oh gosh, that's $1 million question if I haven't heard one. You know, Cuba and I have talked about the importance of allies and how we protect them and give them space and support them, and so that they can have the stamina, the fortitude, and the foundation upon which they can respond to attacks on what is right and what is good. It is a difficult thing to constantly have to feel that you're being harangued because you represent an institution, when really what you're trying to do is use that institution's resources to bring about either social change or at least some type of equitable resolution. How we do that is definitely by continuing to have conversations that are based in reality, and given space for people to feel free to say the things that might be hard. And I know that as a Black woman, that sometimes it's real hard to face criticism about my community. It's hard to hear that what people think about single moms who are struggling to keep food on the table and keep their babies educated and keep a roof over their head. It's hard to hear people talk about the numbers of fathers that some of these single women may have for their children. It's hard to hear about the prison industrial system and how it is more of a place to foster and train our young men than our own communities are. It's really hard. But I know that when I see people in Portland on the streets, young, old, and otherwise engaged, white people, people of all faiths, who want to do this work, who want to be allies, I know that we have to give them that space. And that means that we have to first make sure that we are providing them with the truth and good information about the realities of our communities and what toll racism and implicit bias has taken on our communities, whether it's in the form of health disparities, over incarceration, or just remind people that police brutality is real. And I want to say, fortunately, we've got enough media images today to highlight that. But I'm afraid that one of the things that we also have is some very savvy media campaigns to always criminalize the victims. We have to help articulate those responses and give those those responses to our allies so that they are not without the types of information that will give them good responses to the kinds of brutality that they are witnessing and that they're trying to prevent. We have to also make sure that we are constantly providing each other with support. And if that's a phone call or just a text message or an email, those all mean that we are staying connected. And even in this virtual space that we are working in, we actually have learned to better connect with each other through using technology. That is something that we can do more creatively. And clearly for our members, one of the things that we're proposing is monthly discussions around these issues. And hopefully we bring allies in as part of that conversation, because that helps inspire them, give them the foundation that they need to be in this fight, and also to educate our own folks who need also to have these arguments as well. So we've got to be educating each other.
Thank you for that. George?
Yeah, I just think that, you know, simply put, you know, a little faith and a little optimism, and making sure that we're staying connected. I think Liz talked about that at a good length there. I think that staying connected to one another, staying connected to our family, staying connected to the people that we work with every day. I think that helps us understand the importance of the work that we do every day, and just trying to stay plugged in. I know I try to read a little bit more now. I try to work on some of my own deficiencies, right? Some of the things that I've been trying to get to. And I think that's why we talk about with our teams, we try to make sure we encourage them to unplug. If nothing else right now, you should appreciate who you are, your journey, and the people that you love and that are around you every day that have supported you to get there.
Thank you for that, George. Madam Vice President?
I'm going to use a couple of the words that we've, as a panel, already spoken about. Liz used the word love, and I've taken to having conversations with friends of mine who don't look like me, using grace, grace to myself for knowing that just my experience doesn't mean I am the only experience, and listening to the experience of others, and then grace for others, understanding that the questions that come that in some respects might make me a little angry or feel a sort of way are them being sincere and listening, as George just talked about. You know, my undergraduate was in Springfield, Ohio, very tiny, tiny town. And one of the safe places to do that, and I was one of 90 Black kids, half of us from immigrant from Africa, in a mostly white community, and where we found the ability to have conversations back then about apartheid and freeing Nelson Mandela, was in faith-based environments and education environments. So when you come from a smaller location, I would say that those are places to reach out, because even though it might not be very diverse in skin tone and heritage, thought process around spirituality, thought process around education, you will often find the diversity I have found and the interest in learning from one another. But when we have those conversations, and I agree with Liz, they will be tough, to do so with grace, to listen and respond, sincerely believing that the other person wants us to get to the next space. And I think that's where we'll build those allies, that's where we'll build those partnerships, and that's where, even as a housing authority, we may find some nuggets of things that we can make changes, whether our housing authority has 250 units or 2,000 units. And in doing that, going in there, giving yourself grace, as I said, and for me, my spirituality has grown immensely in the last 7 months. I have read the words that I believe in scripture so differently, and I've been humbled by it. And as George says, the opportunistic hopefulness from it has been amazing. And I hope that that's what I can give in those tough conversations and receive in the same tough conversations.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to try and remember to ask you all this question. It might be something that Liz and I and George and Patricia need to talk about offline, but it's like how we create those spaces and how those spaces are administered, because that's where it gets tricky. And I know that many of my colleagues, especially in the Pacific Northwest, they want to do that work, but they're like, man, here we go. Like, we're providing housing and we know that that exists. So I'm going to table that, but know that that question is coming for y'all, and we might have to convene these groups again just so they can get those questions answered. But I think that that's the realness that we needed to hear from you all, and that's what we're hearing. So I'm going to go to our second set of questions, and I'm going to start with George, then it's going to go to Patricia, then it's going to go to Liz. And the question is, in your opinion, what the heck is equity? What the heck is diversity? And what the heck is inclusion?
Oh, wow. You cutting to it.
Hey, radical honesty here. We don't play around in the Northwest.
I see. I think when we look at that, when I saw that question, first thing when I think of diversity, right? It's respecting and appreciating people that are individuals that are different. Quite simple, right? And I'm gonna do it in the order that I see it. So an inclusion allows us to bring people in those circles or those spaces that are different, that may not look like you. And this is not just about color, right? This is about just making sure that those people are representing, whatever those people are, whatever those ideas are, right? And then I think that when we talk about equity, I think is the equalizer of that, right? Because that's when it is of value. And I think that represents the value of doing all two of those things. And here's what I mean by that. I'm often reminded, especially when I talk to my good friend Liz, about being equal is not, equality is not the same as equity. And everybody, we can say that, you know, since the 60s, when we fought for the things that we fought for, those things were to try to create a system that was going to be equal. Well, we understand if the system wasn't created in a way that was formulated for all of people, then it wasn't going to be equal. And that's how you get these systemic challenges that we have right now. So what equity should bring is, it should bring value of these different people by including them in, so then we're all better as a result of that. So if I'm dealing in a system that provides equity, then it's not unfair. Then I have every opportunity that everybody else has. So if I live in a part of town that's in a different zip code that may have what we call housing opportunities, if I don't live in that area, why is that area housing opportunities and why is mine not? That means that it's not equitable for me. So why is that, does that exist? If it was equitable, then we wouldn't have a situation where someone can misalign something by saying that, you know, we're going to get rid of the suburbs or we're going to do this. That should not be a conversation, because everything should be about diversity and being inclusive. Therefore, we get equity. So quite simply, I think that is very simply put, is my opinion in terms of what diversity and the importance of equity and inclusion is.
Thank you for that, George. I'm going to go to Patricia. We put these questions hard this way because I think many are grappling with these same questions. Give me a thumbs up if you are, because I'm giving myself a thumbs up because I grapple with it myself. Ms. Patricia, we're going to you.
Right on. You know, and these are three words that are buzzwords now and tweets and all over the place, and we do need to know what they mean, and I think the definition differs. When I think of equality, I think of access, that we all have an opportunity to gain access to it: school, housing, medical care, nutrition, safe neighborhoods. Equity means to me that because we all had equality and access, then arguably when you look in these spaces everyone wants to get into, school, healthcare, jobs, that there will be equity because you'll see the same number of folks somewhat represented who were able to get through that open door. So one leads to the other. Equality of access leads to equity of representation. That takes you to the next one. Diversity. Diversity is, as George just got finished saying, the differences that make us beautiful as a nation and as a global community. It could be color, skin, it could be hue, hair texture, origin of race, religion, but it means the rainbow of how we were created by the spirit world to be a global community. Inclusion means if we had the equality to get through the door, equity is represented by all those groups. The groups are diverse, then inclusion means not just that we're able to get in the room, but that we're welcomed, we're treated with respect, and we're treated with grace. And each of us gives it to one another. Because you can include me in the room, and this has happened in my lifetime as a Black woman, but that doesn't mean I'm welcome. And to me, true inclusion means you're welcomed. We may not hang out together, but I respect you, you respect me, and the place is a beautiful thing. So that's kind of how I laid it 3 out.
That's great. I think we're starting to get there. Liz, I got a question for you because Liz knows so much. Break it down to me like I'm a third grader. In 3 minutes, break it down to me to help me understand what I think I'm getting there, y'all. Work with me, I'm getting there. Liz, 3 minutes, break it down to me. What does that mean?
Let me see if I can do this. And I'm going to start with the quilt and the tapestry of humanity, which is our diversity. We are a rich fabric interwoven with all kinds of textures, with all kinds of behaviors, all kinds of beauty. We are connected through our humanity and through the blood that courses through our veins. Yet we are a beautiful race of people. And I mean the one race, the human race. So it's a state of being. This is who we are. We, around the table right now, around the room, we're a diverse group of people. But here's where it gets hard because equity and inclusion are sometimes defined very differently. It means different things for different people. I will tell you that from an equity standpoint, equity to me means that we recognize the limitations and the barriers that people have had to experience in order to get to equality. And we recognize that those people may need more than equality in order to have equity. That means children who are subjected to poor resourced schools, but the schools are beautiful with air conditioning. However, they have inexperienced teachers and they don't have enough materials and books for the kids. Until we take that situation and give the children everything that they need in order to compete, we have not looked at equity. We've dealt with separate but equal for a very, very long time. And we can all sit around this table and say it doesn't work. Inclusion is making sure that the people that we're making decisions about and the people that we claim to be speaking for, including our industry, is to ensure that they are at the table and that their voice is heard, it's welcomed, and it's considered, and it's reflected in the policy decisions that are made. That's when you have real inclusion. It's not enough to be at the table. It's not enough to have a voice. We have to have evidence that what was submitted is actualized through policy. And that's when we'll have true inclusion.
Y'all, I think I'm a little bit smarter as a result. I think I can have my own definition after hearing those three, and it wouldn't sound like theirs, but I feel like I've learned something from there. So we're going to move to the next question, which is this. Many of the individuals that are on this call come from smaller housing authorities or rural or medium or even large housing authorities, but they don't have anyone who does this particular work. How would you suggest that they connect to this type of work, whether it's through NARO, whether it's through you all? I'm going to start with Patricia, then we'll go to you, Liz, and then we'll go to George. But how do they connect? Because some of them just are like, hey, we don't have the resources, but I want to see some of this work happen.
You know, it's funny. That's one of the positives we're going to take from COVID, right? Is that if you had asked me this question a year ago, I'd have been worried about how they get someone to come speak at their conference from across the country, or how they can have the funding from getting someone from a university. We're used to this now. And so arguably using NARO, using the DEI committee that Liz is putting together and the resources, again, using local universities, tap into us. You're welcome to email me and get a hold of a speaker who will help facilitate a conversation safely, and safely with respect to what Liz just talked about, and making sure the voices aren't just heard and written down on the flip chart, but part of the decision factors, and using this space to have agreements up front on how to have a conversation. NARO is there, and quite frankly, I think in the next couple of months, you will see amazing resources put out because of the work that Sister Liz is doing. But not just NARO, I again go back to our faith-based institutions online. And I think that getting the love part in the conversations is going to be needed, whether you're including law enforcement or elected officials. So using this new platform to bring us together across the nation.
Thank you for that. Liz, your thoughts?
So, you know, I'm really excited about the work that the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Committee is doing, and we are getting ready to launch Educate, Innovate, Elevate, and Act. It is will be the descendant of the former Club 21, and we are looking at using that space to develop a syllabus of learning for our members so that we can provide a monthly delivery of resource information, films, media, books, podcasts, articles to help educate our membership. And this, I think, is especially going to be very helpful for those in the smaller areas who are looking for the resources so that we have an ongoing online presence around the kind of information that will help build allies, that will help educate us, that will point us in the right direction, that will give us items and issues to ponder and consider and debate. And that as a part of that monthly syllabus, we also would host monthly discussion boards so that people can have a chance to come in and talk, ask questions, vent, blow off steam. But the whole point would be to continue to deliver the kind of content that will help enlighten our members, whether they're near or far, and show them how equity in many situations is not just around race. It's about class. It's about geography. It's about resource poor areas. And we have small housing authorities that are dealing with that are in remote locations. And so we hope that this is a way to deliver content that no matter how isolated your community might be, you will still have access to best practices and information and dialogue that will give you some support.
Thank you for that, Liz. George, your thoughts?
Yeah, and I'm not going to repeat much of what's been said. I think that our senior vice president and Liz has really spoke to a lot of those things. But I do think that this one thing is important. I think reimagine, and I don't say that lightly. I think that we really are at a point now where we have to reimagine what this should look like. And we should all understand that, and we should all agree that there is a certain amount of inequalities that have existed, that therefore there's some inequities that exist. So if we're going to say that, then we know that we're going to need to be able to do that. Now, I understand many of you came here to house. You got backed into this position. Either you started working as a clerk and now you're the CEO, or now you're a housing specialist. You're not trained to do diversity and inclusion work, and nor should you be responsible for that. However, it should be, because you're going to need it, because you're dealing in a system with a lot of inequities that's not very inclusive. Oftentimes it's not very diverse. So you're going to need to have those resources available to your toolbox. So I'm not challenging you, but I'm saying that maybe we should challenge ourselves and the associations that support us, is that we have to reframe what we're advocating for in terms of when we're advocating. It's not just about legislation. It's about the right reforms and the right partnerships that are going to get you to what you need. What do I mean by that? So someone mentioned institutions and colleges. I think that we should have some partnerships that allow us to have access to those thought leaders in those respective areas, right? Also, ongoing training and relevant training for you to use in your toolbox as resources. It shouldn't be incumbent on you to understand what diversity and inclusion is. It is a very, very slippery slope when you start to try to get into areas that that are very sensitive. But we should make sure that there's resources available to you to do that, whether you're in a small housing authority, a large housing authority. And I specifically want to say small housing authorities, because I think that as we talk about this situation, and I know we got to move on, but I want to really focus on this just for a minute, is that sometimes when we're talking about this situation of inequities and things of that nature, some small housing authorities feel like they're not a part of that conversation. And I think that's what's wrong with our political area right now. We deal with extremes. So we don't get down to the details of a lot of the inequities that exist in every community. Equity matters. We know that equity matters. And we do have to deal with some of these things that have racially been done because the intentions of what's been done. But it doesn't mean that we can't do all of them at the same time.
I felt like I was in church, y'all. I just heard a word. So I wanted, that question was a bit of a setup because I know that Liz and that Patricia and that George have been grappling with this along with many members of NARO's staff. And I encourage all of you to reach out. You can reach out to me and I'll connect you to some of these subcommittees. Many hands make light work. We need your support, experience. We need all of that. We need the thoughts that you have because, you know, these conversations are uncomfortable, but everyone on this call is kind of leaning in, like we're exhausted, but we're ready. And we're going to need to continue to be ready because the work that you're doing is critical. Speaking of the work, because we have about 20 minutes left and we're going to use every single minute we have and we want to leave something open for questioning. But speaking of housing, and I'm going to start with Liz on this one, then we're going to go to George, then we're going to go to Patricia. Where are you currently seeing discrimination in housing? Or where have you seen it? And how are you dealing with it? Because some of us are like, I'm not in the weeds enough to see it, but I know it exists and I don't want to be the next headline. We had a session saying, you don't want to be the next housing authority headline. Where are you seeing it? And how are you dealing with it?
So I will start from sort of the big picture and where I see it, and this was brought home to me working for the planning department, that our local planning departments are contributing to segregation through the way that they downzone, upzone, or parcel out which use is appropriate for where. I see discrimination in housing in raising fair market rents so that people can't use vouchers, even if you might have source of income discrimination in your jurisdiction. That elevation of rents keeps pushing people further and further out of reach to be able to use their voucher. I see discrimination in housing still in terms of where people are able to rent units. Situations and circumstances such as limitations of the number of children that are allowed to live in your household. I see issues around background screening and really doing a deep dive. And I think it was Sunny that said, you know, those housing authorities that look back 20 years and that she knows that she wasn't the same person that she was 20 years ago. Heck, many of us aren't the same person we were 5 years ago. There are so many areas in discrimination in housing, transportation being another one of them, where we plan for bus routes and mass transit routes. Another area is the planning that goes on, and I go back to planning again, the planning that goes on between your local planning department and your school board in determining what school districts your children go to or our children go to. That's discrimination in housing. Another big area is discrimination in housing is around appraisals and properties that are owned by people of color. Side by side, a person who lived next door to the exact same house of someone who's white, their appraisal will differ. And so one of the things that folks have been teaching Black folks to do when they're trying to sell their house or get their properties appraised is take down all the pictures of your Black relatives and all of your ethnic art. And that has a real equity implication, because if your property is appraised for $100,000 less than your neighbor, and it's the exact same house, the only difference is you got Black folks' pictures in your house, then that equity that you just got, excuse my expression, my crude expression, you just got screwed out of because your house got undervalued, means you can't access credit based on the value of your house. There are other ways that it happens. It happens also in the assessing of taxes by our tax assessor, and which neighborhoods with the same houses might have different valuation based on who lives in those houses. I could go on, but I'm not. But it's everywhere. It's in places that we don't even realize, down to the quality of stores that are in our neighborhoods. It is, and it's all tied to housing, where we live and who lives there.
Liz, thank you. I told y'all she's the professor. We just need to give her and George and Patricia about 2 hours, but we don't have 2 hours today. Moving to you, George.
Well, so, you asked the question, where do you see it? I grew up in it. I grew up in an area that was red line. I heard stories of the old Pee Wee store that used to do the shoe shine. They used to have the barber shop and the shoe shining on 9th Street. I've heard all those stories of Gus's Mart that used to be right down the street from that. I grew up when that neighborhood became abandoned, quite frankly, and was gone as a result of redlining and what we've called urban renewal. So I grew up in it, I lived it. However, the interesting part about that is that growing up, and I grew up in the 70s and 80s, we went to school, my primary school was Black, but when I went to junior high school, it was mixed. And we just thought that, hey, we lived there and they lived up there. We didn't recognize at the time that there was so many. We knew that on the hill there was they had bigger houses, but we appreciated where we was from. But we didn't know at the time, and what I've come to find out, that was discrimination in housing. We have lack of businesses there, lack of investment at the time. There was a lot of that taking place. So you ask, where do we see it at now? We're operating in a system that does discriminate. When we talk about, hey, we're going to get more vouchers, where are those vouchers going to go? When in Fort Wayne, Indiana, they're going to go on the Southeast side. The Southeast side hasn't been invested in. So there's discrimination that still exists because the history of what we do was designed to separate. And it was designed to have race neutral things in place for people of color, to separate people of color. So it does still exist. It still discriminates. Or whether you're talking about in rural housing and small housing authorities where they don't have access to health institutions, where they have to travel far to get taken care of. That's discrimination. And we need to be able to say that. And we see it all around. And I think the things that we can do that we've talked about is recognize that it's there. And then when we talked about the earlier question, is then what is it going to take in terms of resources and tools for us to address it? And like I said, you can do that by taking care of some of the systems that permeate, because it's a shame that when we say where you live is going to determine how you're going to live your life and where you're going to end up at. So if we know the truth to that, first of all, let's fix that, right? I think that's whack. Let's fix that. But then if we're going to fix it, but if we have our way, that's why we talk about housing expanded. We have to partner and collaborate with those individuals in our communities.
George, hold that thought, because that's going to, you're getting ahead of my whole little thing. He read all my questions, was like, I'm going to just say everything right now.
Oh, that's good.
Still
I'm sorry.
A little thunder. Okay. Madam VP, please.
Capitalizing on what Liz and George just talked about, I would say I see it today, even as we develop new units. Where the funding is geared to go is often on infill, and infill is important, but the land that we're often infilling on is dirty in ways that we don't even want to talk about. As George has talked about, they're not near transportation hubs. They're not near the social assets like schools and nutrition hubs. They're food deserts, so that the families that are fortunate enough to get that housing now have an extra struggle of living their daily lives and having it done in a way where they can thrive and not get into a nice unit, but still worry about how to get the babies to school and mom and dad to work. The size of the units, the amenities of the units, just the way that we're funded to build affordable housing by the nature of what we fix, it's beautiful stuff. We know we go right up the street to across the railroad lines, and for the same price per unit, arguably the unit has a very different look, different feel, different quality. It's LEED certified. So I still see it right now today as we try to do our good work. And it's part of what we've been fighting in NARA and through legislative advocacy to make sure that there's equity, to Liz's point, in how we're funded to build housing for our folk. And then on the flip side, home ownership. I was recently humbled in my neighborhood, and in my neighborhood, I was fortunate to get in. I've got the smallest house in the block, but walking my dog, black lab at 11 o'clock at night, I'm stopped by a police officer who just was curious as to where I lived, right? So there's still discrimination. And, I'm a bad sister, right? But I don't think I'm, looking like I need to be stopped by a police officer is what I'm doing, walking my dog in the middle of the neighborhood. So there's still the inequity on even where we're supposed to be. But the hope is all of us are on this call, and I think there's 39 of us. There was 40 a moment ago. We are geared to making that change. And those conversations that we talked about, we are geared to make sure that funding changes on how we can develop new stuff, and having the opportunity to teach our residents and empower them to be part of the decisions made for HOA rules and community rules and social service rules. So I think we're on our way, but that's where I see it right now today.
Thank you for that. Brandy Sargent put in the chat, she said there's discrimination in our very name, public and Indian housing. So but we're starting to address those things, and I can appreciate that. So this is going to be our final question, and I'm going to leave it to each of the speakers, and I'm actually going to ask Sunny Shaw to jump in on this after Liz Glenn. So it's going to be George Guy, Patricia, Liz, and then Sunny. And the question is this, and then we're going to open it up to the rest of the team. The question is this: now that we've talked about all the ills, what do we do? What do we do? What do you see our path forward being, so we can leave here with a little bit of hope? So we're going to go to George. That's why I said, George, you always do this to me. We think the same way. I'm like, George, stop it. And then we'll go to Patricia, we'll go to Liz, and then we're going to ask Sunny to weigh in just a little bit, and then we'll open up questions for the team.
Thanks, Cupid. And again, I just want to say thank you to you and PNRC, and again, acknowledge some of the things that you all are doing. They're innovative in this part of our country. I think that you all have provided a certain amount of innovation. Listen, we got to acknowledge what it is. And I think we got to be able to say that there's some inequities that exist, there's systemic racism. There hasn't been a whole lot of equity in terms of our small housing authorities in our rural communities. We have to say that there's been a lack of reform in old systems that have not been very equitable for all. And then we have to make sure that we're talking about what the solution should be. And I think I talked about a lot of them, and we have to be opportunistic and optimistic as well as we address them. And we have to be very intentional on how we do that. Some of these things, Cupid talked about, some of the things that I've done in my career. I didn't start off in housing. I started off in education, and I started off doing community work and community building. So I'm probably in this space. I know what some of those tools are. I know what some of those resources in the community are to go get what we need in terms of some of those inequities. But we got to identify them, and we got to do something about them. I think if we stand by any longer and do it, when we say that our name is implicit as to what we are in terms of discrimination, then we have to start coming up with solutions to fix it. And I do think we have to think big. And I do think we have to challenge our associations. We have to change the things that we're advocating for that make more sense, that speak of reforms, that correcting some of these ills, that will allow us the right type of partnerships and collaborations in our communities, whether it be educational institutions, whether it be the schools. I'm talking about the things that we did before. And these things they were done before in the 90s, FDEP. We're talking about things that work, but we allowed folks to come in and make cuts to people and systems that couldn't afford it. And now here we are. So we got to be relentless about our next effort, but we got to be optimistic and opportunistic as we go forward.
Good word, George, good word. Okay, Miss Patricia.
I'm gonna jump on optimistic. I am optimistic that the 40 folks on this call will be part of the we, because I'm humbled that you're here to hear from George, Liz, and Cupid and myself and our president, Sunny. But there's no doubt in my mind that several of the names and the faces I see, you have ideas, you have experiences. We need you by our side. So the first step is to join us. The subcommittees, the advocacy work you're doing locally, bring it to the table. When Liz hosts those monthly meetings, join us. When we do the letter writing, join us. If you've got something special going on in your neighborhood or your community, lift it up, make the connection. We could always use a new voice and a new idea. And I think that's where it starts, is that we all take responsibility and make a commitment to being part of the we. And then, as George said, we will come up with the ideas, but we'll have the power in the unity of all of us to actually get the work done. Because with many folks, as you said, it's less work, but it's going to be powerful work.
Thank you for that, Madam Vice President. Liz.
And there's an old African proverb that says, if you want to get someplace quickly, go alone. But if you want to go somewhere far, we need to all go together. And so as DEI grapples with some of the issues in terms of a framework for operation, for equity, for inclusion, we've operationalized some discrete programs that we are asking people to please come join us. In fact, some of these subcommittees may be larger than the advisory committee itself. And that's because we want to make sure that we have a huge tent to give people roles that are meaningful. And so in our Educate, Innovate, Elevate Act, formerly Club 21, we want a huge number of people to join into this conversation and to take on roles of moderator and discussion hosts, to take on the role of suggesting content. You know, what's a favorite film that you saw that really made you cry, that made you think, that made you want to act? Because at the heart of what we want to do is we want to figure out a strategy for action. We can talk, and we do that very well. We can educate, and we will do that very well. But where we need to go is to make sure that our policy agenda reflects an action agenda. And we have to start off by, as George points out, we have to identify where discrimination exists. And until we actually identify that, we can't even begin to identify the strategies and solutions to undo some of that. So we have to do that. So our policy subcommittee, and I'm grateful that Cupid has played a very important role in helping to get that launched, is focusing on identifying those discriminatory actions and then coming up with recommendations, policy recommendations that we can act on to address those inequities or that exclusion. We also are establishing a partnerships subcommittee, which I think will be really critical in determining who out there are our partners that can both advocate on our behalf in terms of housing, but all the other issues that are relative for housing to be sustainable and to be viable. And that includes our university partners. That includes our other advocates that are advocating on health, looking at healthcare institutions. And so we want to engage you and for you to be a part of our policy subcommittee, our EIEA committee, subcommittee, as well as our partnerships committee. And we're open to bringing as many people on as possible because we want to spread the work out and make sure that we can include our members in this process rather than dictating the process. So that's
Absolutely.
where my hope is.
I'm gonna hand it over to President Sunny Shaw for her thoughts.
Thank you, Cupid. What a wonderful surprise that I get to have some comments for this group. What an amazing discussion this has been. So congratulations to all of you for leading this group in just a great discussion. So when I think about moving forward and what are our tasks, my first thing that I always think about is my circle of influence. And I think that everyone that's on this call, all 41 of you, first thing we need to do is look at our circle of influence, okay? Because we have great responsibility to that group. I'm gonna a little bit of a thing there. There's one of my circle of influence, okay? He's not ever gonna have to be taught to don't wear a dark hoodie out at night. He's never gonna have to be taught the rules of getting pulled over by a police officer. But this little dude is in my circle of influence, and he needs to be taught that he has a responsibility to use the privilege that he has been born with to speak for other people, to be an advocate and to be an ally. So I look first at circle of influence. The next thing that I look at is going to be the people that we serve who are impacted by these policies that, we call just everyday business. We just call it everyday business. So we need to advocate for change so that we can change those policies and more accurately and appropriately serve our families, giving them opportunity and equity. And finally, the next thing that I look at is I'm going to challenge you that are on this call, and I think I've already said this 2 or 3 times on this conference, is go back to your agency and take a look at the policies that you have at your agency that are having desperate impact on people of color. You know, what are your look back periods? Yes, Liz, I did say 20 years. We've got some agencies that have a 20-year look back period. We should be ashamed of that. We should be absolutely ashamed of that. We have policies in place that are keeping families apart. We should be ashamed of that. And you have the opportunity to change policy starting at your agency. There are things that we have in place that are not HUD requirements. There are things that, you know, just been on the books forever and, you know, wasn't broken. Why change it? We have to change it. The next thing is look at policy on the national level. Get involved with NARO. Advocate for change. Follow Liz's advice. Become a part of DEI. Be able to be a leader in these conversations. Even if you aren't traveling to conferences, you can still be a part of DEI and use your voice. So moving forward, circle of influence. It's going to be advocating and using your voice for those we serve. And then it's going to be changing policy. We can talk all day long, but until we're changing policy at our own agencies, we aren't walking the walk. We're just talking about things we'd like to do. So start with your own backyard and clean up your policies. So I'm hoping that that's not stern. I'm hoping that that is just, you know, a path forward. And for those of you who have been part of this conversation, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And with your help, we can change culture, we can change the future, and we can change our country. Thanks, Cupid.
Thank you for that. So you all, it's been a good convo. Happy to have both my brother and my sister and my oracle on. Our national president is on. I want to say shout out Brandy Sargent, I see you. She said count her in. Akia, she said count me in. Pam Taylor, I see you, Pam. She said I'm all in. Jen, she said count me in. Okay, Jen, I see you. We're all going to need all of the efforts together. We're about at time, so I'm not going to extend it. PNRC, will you please put up the code? I want to thank you all for being a part of another successful conference that we've had. I'm going to give all of you, well, most of you a hand clap. I'm going to give some of you a thumbs up because some of you deserve a thumbs up. If you didn't get a thumbs up, you got a hand clap. If you got a hand clap, you didn't get a thumbs up because I try to influence and help everyone. So if you are playing the game, put people 100. Let's give a big thanks to our speakers, Elizabeth Glenn, Patricia Wells, George Guy, and at the end, Sunny Shaw. Much love to you all, and we appreciate you. And with that, we thank you for being a part of this and have a good rest of your week. Thank you all. Much love. See you later.